Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar on tips for conducting a quantitative survey. And just before we begin, I'd like to give you this contact information if you're interested in additional support outside of this webinar. We do offer services to help with all aspects of the dissertation. So if you are interested in more one-on-one consulting to help with your dissertation project, you can contact us using this information. And so first, let's just go over what we're going to be covering today and going over tips for conducting a quantitative survey study. So first, we're going to talk a little bit about how to select the appropriate instruments to put into your survey. And then I'll briefly discuss online versus face-to-face surveys and which may be more appropriate to use. And then we'll spend some time talking about specific tips for actually constructing your survey. And this will focus mainly on setting up a successful online survey study. And we'll also talk a little bit about how to administer your survey. So how to actually what to do to send the survey out to participants and things to consider there. And then we'll conclude by briefly talking about special considerations for repeated measures or longitudinal surveys. And then at the end, we'll have an opportunity for you to ask questions. So if you do have questions, you can feel free to type those questions into the question section. And if those questions are not answered during the presentation, we'll be answering those questions at the end. So just keep in mind that we will be answering questions at the end, not during the presentation. Okay, so first, let's talk about the selection of survey instruments. So the first thing you need to do before you can even conduct your survey is obviously to select the survey instruments that you're going to use in your study. And this should be based off of your problem, purpose, and research questions. So you want to go through your problem statement, your purpose statement, and your research questions and identify all of the variables that you need to measure for your study. And you need an instrument that can measure each of those variables to be included in your survey. So for instance, if your research question is transformational leadership correlated with job satisfaction after controlling for age, gender, and ethnicity, then you'd want to look at that research question and identify all of the variables that are in that question. So for instance, you'll need an instrument that measures transformational leadership. You'll need an instrument that measures job satisfaction. You'll also need survey questions that measure age, gender, and ethnicity. So it really helps to just go through all of your research questions and even back to the problem and purpose to make sure that you've identified all of the variables that you need to measure to conduct your study. And so from there, you can find an instrument to measure each variable. And so once you've identified your variables, how do you actually find an instrument to measure those variables? Well, where you want to look first is to your theoretical framework and literature review to find an instrument that has already been validated by past researchers that measures each variable that you are interested in your study. You really want to avoid creating your own instrument to measure variables. And this is because instrument creation can really be a study in and of itself. And schools often will discourage students from creating their own instruments or may even have guidelines that prohibit students from creating their own instruments. They may have requirements that you have to use an instrument that has already been validated in the literature. And so to find a validated instrument, you need to look to the literature and to the specific theory that you're using to see what past researchers have used to measure those variables. The theoretical framework in particular is a good place to start looking, because then you can find an instrument that aligns directly with the theory that you're using. Because there might be an instrument that was developed specifically for that theory, and that would be the most appropriate instrument to use. Otherwise, you really just want to look through the literature and see what kinds of survey instruments people have used to measure the variables of your study, and you want to pick instruments from the literature. And during this process, you want to keep in mind that you need to be able to obtain the complete instrument and the scoring information for the instrument. And often this involves contacting whoever first created the instrument, so the author of the instrument, or it might be a company that has the rights to the instrument that you may need to obtain the instrument from. So for instance, the measure of transformational leadership, which is the multi-factor leadership questionnaire, the MLQ, that is distributed by a company called Mindgarden. So if you want to use that instrument, you would have to contact Mindgarden to get permission and information to use the instrument. And so you want to make sure that you can obtain the complete instrument and scoring information, because if you can't, then you won't be able to use that instrument for your study. I've seen situations where students have requested an instrument and they weren't given the full instrument, they were just given a sample of the questions, and then they went through their whole data collection with just a portion of the instrument in their survey, and it created a lot of problems for them. So you don't want to run into that kind of situation where you do your data collection and then realize you didn't have the correct full instrument in your study. You want to make sure that you establish that beforehand. And for this reason, you may want to consider looking into one or two backup instruments in case the first instrument that you find, for whatever reason, you're unable to use it. So for instance, you might not be able to contact the author to get permission to use the instrument, or you might not be able to obtain the items or the scoring information. So in cases like that, you want to have a backup, maybe another instrument or two that measures the variable you're interested in to use in case your first choice of an instrument does not work out. So now that we talked about how to select an appropriate instrument, now let's discuss online versus face-to-face surveys. So it's been increasingly preferable to conduct studies online, obviously, for reasons that these days we really aren't able to conduct face-to-face studies as easily. And there's obviously the convenience of online studies, but sometimes you have to conduct surveys face-to-face, or that might be the best way for you to conduct your survey. However, if you are going to conduct a face-to-face survey, you should be aware of the limitations of conducting a survey face-to-face. And some of those limitations have to do with how the participants can respond and also the data entry. So in face-to-face surveys, where participants are just completing the surveys, physically using like a paper and pencil, you have less control over how the participants can respond. So you won't be able to control if participants skip questions, if you have open-ended questions, Participants will have to write those in by hand. Sometimes you might have issues reading participants' handwriting. Sometimes participants can fill out the forms incorrectly. Like for instance, maybe for a multiple choice question, they might select 2 answers instead of just 1. So there are all kinds of issues with face-to-face surveys in that you can't really control, or you have far less control over these types of issues where participants can fill out the survey incorrectly, or there might be ambiguities in their responses. And this can also lead to potential errors in data entry. So if you are using a face-to-face survey, an extra step that you have to do is you have to take that physical survey form and enter it into an electronic format to be able to do a statistical analysis on it. And so errors can occur during that data entry phase. So as you're entering in the responses into a spreadsheet, for instance, you could have a typo where you enter in the wrong number. So those types of data entry errors can occur as well if you're doing a face-to-face survey. And really for these reasons and more, it is preferable to do an online survey if you can, because online surveys greatly mitigate these issues. You can set up your survey, which we'll see later, in ways that can help minimize participant errors. And you also don't have to worry about data entry errors at all because there's no data entry step when you do the survey online. And so if you do decide to do your survey online, you'll want to choose an online survey hosting service that fits the needs of your study. And what students will often do is choose a professional commercial online hosting service, such as SurveyMonkey or Qualtrics. Those right now are the 2 most popular online survey services. And they're popular because they can host online surveys and offer a wide variety of question formats and the ability to implement survey logic for complex survey designs. So they really give you all the options that you need to host any type of online survey, whether the survey is simple or complex. And another potential benefit of these services is that they also offer data collection services. So if you're stuck and you don't really have a way to recruit or reach participants, services like SurveyMonkey and Qualtrics have a separate service that may help you recruit participants. And then, well, those all sound like good things, but then obviously the downside of a service like SurveyMonkey or Qualtrics is that you do have to pay for them. So they do charge fees for their services. And so that's something to consider when doing your study. However, there are other options for survey hosting that are free, such as Google Forms. So if you have a Google account, you can use Google Forms for free to set up an online survey. Granted, with Google Forms, there are less options in terms of the question formatting and survey logic. So this would be more suitable if you have a very simple survey that doesn't require complex questions or response formats. So those are just some things to keep in mind when you're thinking about doing an online or a face-to-face survey, or if you're going online, what online survey service are you going to choose? So now let's kind of get into more of the meat of the presentation, which is the actual construction of your survey. And I'm going to, for the most part, focus on constructing online surveys because this is really the preferable method of conducting survey studies these days. So this will mostly focus on considerations for online surveys, but a lot of these things can apply to face-to-face surveys as well. And I'll also show some screenshot of examples of some survey building in some of these examples, and those were taken from SurveyMonkey. So in the examples that you'll see, you'll be seeing how this survey creation would look like if you were doing it in SurveyMonkey, but you would see similar options if you were constructing surveys in Qualtrics or something like Google Forms. So the first thing that you need to do when you construct your survey is to set up your consent form. And generally, if you're doing an online survey, the consent form will be the first page or section of the survey. So when participants click the link to your online survey, the consent form should be the very first thing that they see. And so this will just give information about the study, the risks involved in the study, what participants will be asked to do, things of that nature, so that participants can make an informed decision about whether to participate or not. And then at the end of this section, you'll want to include an item that participants must check off or endorse to indicate that they consent to participate. So it could just be a question that you put at the end of the section that says, check this box if you have read all the above information and agree to participate in the survey. And you should set up your survey such that participants can't continue and answer the rest of the questions unless they check off this item and agree to participate. And then after the consent form, you want to establish eligibility screening. So you want to include questions in your survey that screen participants based on your study inclusion or exclusion criteria. So for instance, if you're doing a study on nurses and you require the nurses to have, for instance, a certain number of years of experience or work in a specific area of nursing, then you'll want questions at the beginning of your survey that ask participants if they meet those qualifications. And if they don't, then the survey can be set up to where participants who indicate that they don't meet those qualifications can be automatically disqualified from the survey. So you don't want to, force or have participants who are ineligible answering the entire survey because there's not really much point to that. So you want to screen participants at the beginning of the survey to establish that they are the right participants that you're looking for and they are eligible to participate in your study. And you want to ask those questions at the beginning. And if they indicate that they don't meet those qualifications, then you want to set up your survey to exclude those people and just exit them from the survey before they can answer any of the other questions. And then you can consider other demographic questions, so any demographics that aren't involved in your eligibility screening. So things like age, gender, ethnicity, any demographics that you're collecting, you'll want to include those questions. And the demographic questions can be asked either at the beginning or at the end of the survey generally. It really just depends on what you have established in your data collection procedures in terms of the order of the questions. All right, so now we'll go over a couple of tips for actually creating your survey questions. So the first tip that I have is to make sure that you present instructions for each instrument or each section of the survey. You don't just want to present a set of questions that have no instructions, because participants may not know how to answer them. You may be able to look at the questions and intuitively know how you're supposed to answer the questions, but to a participant, that may not be so obvious. So you want to make sure that you include the instructions for each set of questions for each instrument that you're using. Generally, with a survey instrument, it will come with a set of instructions like what you see here. It's usually just a couple sentences explaining what the instrument is and how participants should respond. So for instance, this says, please read each statement carefully and decide if you feel this way. And then provides more instructions about what the different response options means and how to use them. So you want to make sure you include these instructions for each section of the survey. The next tip is you really want to use the required response option whenever possible. So in pretty much any survey hosting service, whether it's SurveyMonkey or Qualtrics or Google Forms, you will have the option to require participants to answer a question. And what this means is that if participants don't answer that question and they try to move on to the next section of the survey, they will get a message telling them that they missed a question and they have to go back and answer it. And you really want to use this as much as you can so that participants will answer all of the questions in the survey and you'll reduce the amount of missing responses that you have pretty drastically if you invoke this option. So there are a lot of reasons why participants might skip a question. They might just miss it by accident, or they might feel that the question doesn't apply to them. But you really should use this required response option as much as you can to reduce the likelihood that participants are going to just miss a question by accident. And so the next tip now is to use matrix options for sets of Likert type questions. So in most quantitative survey instruments, they usually consist of sets of Likert type questions where maybe it's 10 items and they're rated on a scale from strongly disagree to strongly agree. If you have questions in this format and you have sets of Likert items that use the same scale, and you have groups of questions that go together, you can set them up using matrix options, which look like this, where it's kind of set up in a table where on the far left, you'll actually see the items, and then you'll have the responses, strongly disagree to strongly agree across rows for each item. And this is really the most efficient way to set up these Likert type questions. It'll be a lot easier in terms of setting them up for the survey on your end. It'll take a lot less time than creating separate multiple choice questions for every single Likert item. And it'll also be easier and more intuitive for your participants to answer the questions when they're set up this way. So definitely use the matrix options if you have Likert type questions in your survey. Another very important tip to keep in mind is validation options. So you really want to use validation options if you have any questions in your survey that involve free response or text entry. So for instance, maybe you have a question where you ask the participant's age and you just have them enter in a number rather than choose from a set of choices. If you have questions like this, you want to use validation to ensure that participants are answering the question correctly. So if it's something like age, where they're just entering their age in years as a number, you can set up the question so that it only accepts responses that are whole numbers within a certain range, for instance. So if you're asking for participants' age, you wouldn't really want them to type out any words, like write out their age in words, or type anything other than a number that represents their age in years. And using this option, you can ensure that participants don't type in any incorrect or invalid responses for those types of questions. And then another really important tip, and this applies very generally, is that you want to avoid check all that apply type questions whenever it is possible. So in most survey building services, this will appear as checkbox questions. And you'll know the difference in that the symbol next to each of the item responses will be a square checkbox rather than a circle. A circle is used in multiple choice format, and the square checkbox is used in the check all that apply format. And you really want to use multiple choice rather than check all that apply in most cases. So for instance, if you're just asking a simple demographic question like gender, and there's only and you want participants to be able to choose only one answer, then you definitely want to use the multiple choice format rather than the checkbox format. And there might be some situations where the check all that apply format is the most appropriate for the type of data that you're trying to collect. But in general, if you can avoid the check all that apply format, you want to use the multiple choice format instead, because the check all that apply questions are very messy to work with when it comes to doing your data cleaning and actual data analysis. So you should definitely avoid those whenever it is possible. And so just some final points on creating your questions and kind of finishing up your survey. First, you want to make sure that you enter all of the questions or items for all of the instruments. Again, going back to making sure you have the full set of items for each instrument. You want to make sure that every question for that instrument is entered into your survey. You also want to double check and make sure that the response format or the scale for each question is correct for each instrument. So you want to double check all your Likert questions and make sure that it's the correct number of points on the Likert scale, and that the labels or anchors for the points on the Likert scale are correct. And then finally, you want to make sure that if you have any grouping variables in your study, you want to make sure that you have questions in your survey that indicate group membership. So for instance, if your study is about people in the field of education, and you're doing a comparison of principals and teachers in their survey responses, then you want to make sure that you have a question in your survey that asks the participant if they're a principal or a teacher. Because otherwise you might get to the end of your data collection and you realize that you have all these responses, but you don't know which responses are the principals and which responses are the teachers. So you definitely want to make sure that there is some way for participants to indicate which group they are in if you have that kind of variable in your study. So now let's go over a few tips for administering your survey. And first, and this goes back to what we just finished talking about, is double check your survey before you send it to participants. So you want to check everything from potential typos, missing questions. You want to make sure that the logic of the survey is correct. And by survey logic, I mean things like your consent form. You should test to make sure that if the participant does not agree to the consent form, that they are not able to continue with the rest of the survey, or if they indicate that they are not eligible from the screening questions, you want to make sure that the survey works correctly and disqualifies participants based on the screening questions. You want to make sure that all of that is working correctly. So you want to double check that before you send to participants. And also specifically for online studies, you want to ensure that the survey works on multiple computers or devices. So you might want to consider sending the link to a colleague or trying to open the link on a different computer than the one you normally work on, or try opening the link even in a different web browser to make sure that the survey is working across all different devices so that participants won't have any problems. And another thing that may seem obvious but is very important is that before you send the survey to participants, you have to make sure that you have all of the proper approvals for conducting your study. So at minimum, this would be approval from your institutional review board, or IRB, to actually conduct the study. You want to make sure that you have IRB approval before you send the survey to any participants. And if you have any additional approvals, for instance, specific site approvals, if you are conducting your survey in a specific site or population that requires additional approvals, you want to make sure that you have those before you collect any data. Another thing to keep in mind when administering your survey is reminders. So you do want to occasionally remind participants who you've sent the survey to complete the survey, but you don't want to bombard your participants with reminder emails, because this will really turn participants off from your study and have the opposite effect. So you want to send reminders judiciously. You do want to send reminders, especially if your data collection is going a bit slow, but you don't want to send so many reminders that you're basically harassing your participants to complete the survey. So something like a reminder once a week, or a reminder after 2 weeks after you initially send the survey, is reasonable. And oftentimes you'll want to establish your procedures for doing reminders as part of your methodology. So that's something to keep in mind as well. And then finally, as you are collecting your data, you want to keep your committee members and your chair informed about your progress so that they know what's going on. So you want to keep them informed about, how slow or fast data collection is going. So because they might have specific suggestions for you in case it seems like you're not going to hit your sample size requirement. So if data collection is going really slow, you're not getting a lot of participants, you want to make sure that you keep your committee informed about that, be very transparent with them, tell them what's going on, give them updates about how many people you have, and how you've been administering the survey. And they may actually give you advice on how you can increase your response rate, or they may give you options for what to do if it doesn't seem like you're going to meet your sample size requirement. So definitely keep your committee informed throughout your data collection on how your progress is going. And finally, before we get to the questions, I want to mention some special considerations for repeated measure surveys. So these would be any type of survey where you have participants fill out the survey at more than one point in time. So for instance, maybe you're doing something like a pretest, post-test study where you have participants fill out the survey as a pretest, and then maybe a week or 2 weeks or a month later, they fill out the survey again as a post-test after they have gone through some kind of intervention or some kind of condition where you'd want to assess their post-test. So in situations like these, you'll be required to match each of the participants' survey responses together. And in order to do this, each completed survey will need some kind of identifier or code attached to it that lets you know who the participant was that answered that survey, so that you can match the responses together. And so when you do this, you should have a section of your survey where participants can enter in their identifier each time that they take the survey. And there are a lot of different methods you can use in terms of assigning identifiers to participants. And the method that is best will kind of depend on your specific data collection requirements and if you're required to collect the data anonymously, or if you are permitted to collect any personally identifying information in order to match the surveys together. So an example of a personal identifier would be an email address, as this is information that participants provide that would allow you to personally identify them. But it is a good method for matching surveys together because you wouldn't expect any two participants to have the exact same email address. Everyone will have their own unique email address, so it's a good identifier for matching surveys. However, obviously the downside to this is that if it's personally identifying information, it does allow you to identify who that participant is, and so your survey will no longer be anonymous. However, there are ways to get around this and still conduct the survey in an anonymous way by using an anonymous or semi-anonymous identifier. So this could be something like a researcher assigned ID number or code, or you can come up with a method where the participant creates their own anonymous or semi-anonymous code that they can enter each time they complete the survey. So for instance, a semi-anonymous code may be you ask the participant to enter in their middle initial plus the last 4 digits of their phone number. You could use this code because it would be unique enough to where no two participants will be entering in the same code, but it's not enough information for you to personally identify that person. So in cases where you really want to keep the responses anonymous, you can use a more anonymous or semi-anonymous identifier for linking the surveys together. And then a final consideration would be if you have separate time points for your data collection in order to keep all of your responses organized and know exactly which responses correspond to each time point. So which responses are the pretest, which responses are the post-test. you will want to create separate survey links if you're doing the study online. So you can create a survey for your pretest and then make a copy of that survey and do a separate survey link for your post-test. So that way the pretest and the post-test responses are kept separate and you know exactly which ones are the pretest and which are the post-test. Right. And with that, that is the end of the presentation. So again, here's some contact information in case you are interested in more one-on-one or additional services outside of this webinar. And now we can go ahead and get to some questions. So I'm going to take a look and see what questions we have in here. All right, so the first question that I have is there any truth to the statement that a Likert scale must be a 7-point scale in order to allow for non-parametric data analysis? This is a really good question, and there is a lot of kind of not so much debate, but discussion among statistics scholars in terms of how Likert items should be treated in terms of parametric and non-parametric analysis. So first of all, for non-parametric data analysis, generally for non-parametric, your responses can be either ordinal or nominal, depending on the type of analysis that you're doing. So the number of points on the Likert scale wouldn't matter so much for a non-parametric analysis. What matters is for a parametric analysis, because a parametric analysis means that you're making distributional assumptions about the data in order for the results of that analysis to be valid. So for instance, you might assume that the data are normally distributed. That would be a parametric data analysis. And for analyses like that, some would argue that a Likert scale cannot be considered a continuous variable that can be used in a parametric analysis. Although there are some texts that would argue that if you have a high number of points on your Likert scale, so for instance, if you have 5 or more points on your Likert scale, then that will be close enough to an interval level variable and may be appropriate to use in parametric analyses. That being said, with Likert type items, it's very often the case that you don't just have one Likert item, you usually have a set of Likert items. So for instance, you might have an instrument that has 10 Likert items, and those are used to measure some variable or construct. When you take those 10 Likert items together and put them together into a composite score, so whether you're adding those responses together or averaging the responses together, even though each individual item is on a Likert scale, when you add all of the responses together, they create a composite score that kind of goes beyond an ordinal Likert level variable and can be considered a continuous or interval level variable. Generally, the consensus is that if you are taking multiple Likert items and putting them together into a composite score, then that can be treated as continuous and can be used in a parametric analysis. However, if you're just looking at one individual Likert item, and if it's on a 5-point scale or less, then you may want to consider that ordinal and use a non-parametric analysis. So the next question is, I've heard that the Likert scale items should always be ordered from strongly disagree to strongly agree. rather than strongly agree to strongly disagree. And there's no real rule for this. And in fact, sometimes people would even argue in certain areas, if you're doing survey construction, that sometimes you should actually vary the response format, especially if you have a very long survey, because it will help keep the attention of your participants. Because, for instance, if you have a 200 question survey and all of the questions are answered from strongly disagree to strongly agree, you get 10, 20, 30 questions in, you can imagine that participants may start to zone out or go on autopilot as they answer all these questions if it's a very long survey. So if you actually break your survey up into sections rather than have really long sections of the survey that all use the same response format, if you break it up into sections and if you actually vary the response format of the questions, then you can actually help to keep participants engaged and keep their attention and reduce non-attentive responding. That said, there are also ways to assess if participants are responding non-attentively, which is to randomly throughout your survey, you can put in what's called attention check questions, where it might just be a random question embedded into the survey that asks, please answer this response for this question. Or like, please answer strongly agree to this question. And it's just a way for you to check to make sure that participants are actually paying attention. So if they answer that question incorrectly, that may be evidence that they are not responding attentively, and you might consider excluding participants who don't answer the attention check questions correctly. So that's just another option. Okay, so another question is, do you need to include questions about gender in your demographic questions if they do not inform your research questions? So generally, you don't necessarily have to include any questions that don't measure variables that are part of your research questions, but a lot of times people will want basic demographic information about your sample, even if it's not really related to your research questions, but that would be something to kind of determine in the methodology stage in terms of what demographic information you want to collect in order to characterize your sample. Because it is pretty typical to at least report some demographic information to give your readers an idea of what the characteristics of your sample are. So even if they're not specifically tied to your research questions, it can be important to include at least some basic demographic information so that you are able to give a good description of your sample to your readers. And so next question is, what are your views about reverse coding? So reverse coding will really be specific to the instrument that you are using. So you'll find that some instruments will have reverse coded items, some instruments won't. That's really just part of each instrument's validation process. There are different philosophies on whether you should have reverse coded items or not. And it really only comes into play in your own instrument creation if you end up having to create your own instrument. So if you're using an instrument that has already been established by the literature, you would just use the items as they are, whether they have reverse coding or not. And if they do have reverse coding, you just have to make sure that you take that into account when you're cleaning your data. But in terms of, philosophically, in terms of instrument creation, should you use reverse coded items or not, that's kind of a different discussion altogether. But the main thing is that if you're using an instrument that has already been validated and it has reverse coded questions, you want to use the questions as they are in the instrument. You don't want to change it. You just want to be mindful of if there are any negatively reworded questions that you need to do reverse coding for once you get to your data cleaning stage. Okay, so the next question is, mention that 10 items for one instrument, so there's a minimum number of items required in case I cannot create as many as 10 items. Sometimes I think 10 items will make respondents fatigued. So this really goes back to the specific instruments that you are using. So going back to identifying an instrument from the literature that measures your variable of interest. If you're concerned about participant fatigue and there being too many questions, you can try to see if there's a short form of the instrument that you are planning to use. So a lot of instruments will go through a development process where initially maybe they'll have a lot of items, but then down the road, researchers will do more work on the instrument and maybe they'll develop a shorter form of the instrument, which will be, they'll often call it a short form, where the instrument will measure the same variable, but they'll reduce the number of items. So that's something to consider. And that if you want to kind of reduce the time it takes to take your survey and reduce the potential for survey fatigue among your participants, you may want to do your due diligence in terms of researching the instruments and see if there are short forms available for the specific variables that you're trying to measure. And then the next question is, what kind of attention checks could be used in surveys? So, we talked about this a little bit already, but attention checks would just be, you have you're going through your set of questions through your instruments, and then just randomly in the middle of those questions, you might have an item that says, please select strongly agree for this question. So it should be basically just an instruction for participants to follow to show that they are paying attention to what the questions are saying. So you could just insert, one or more of those items throughout the survey, especially if it's a long survey, to make sure that they are responding to those attention checks correctly. Because if you see that any participants are not answering those questions correctly, then it could be evidence that they aren't paying attention. So that's a way for you to exclude non-attentive responding. And the next question, what is the difference between multiple choice and check all that apply? So let's see if I can go back to the slides to show the difference here. So going back to this check all that apply issue versus multiple choice. So the difference between these is that in multiple choice format, you have a set of choices that participants choose from, but participants can only select one answer choice. So for instance, if you have the question of gender, and your answer choices are male and female, if you set this up in the multiple choice format, it means that participants can only choose one response. They can only choose male or they can only choose female. They have to pick one or the other. In the check all that apply format, it means that you give participants a set of choices, but they can select as many of those choices as they want. So this would be applicable if you're giving them some kind of question where they're allowed to choose multiple answers. Like for instance, if you have a question like, you know, what forms of media do you use to get information about politics? And maybe you have like newspaper, online articles, websites. You have a bunch of different options, and they can choose which ones they use. That would be a situation where a checkbox format or a check all that apply would be appropriate. But if you're asking a question where you really only want participants to choose one answer out of the choices that you give them, then you should always use the multiple choice format. And again, the way you can tell the difference between the two types is that in the multiple choice format, the buttons next to the answer choices will be circles. And in the checkbox format, the buttons next to the answer choices will be square checkboxes. So that's a way for you to check to see which type of question format you have applied. And like we discussed before, you usually will want to use the multiple choice format instead of the check all that apply, especially if you only want participants to be able to check one answer. Right. So the next question is, I want to judge whether my respondent is under the poverty line or not, but I cannot directly ask yes or no. So how would you do this? So in these cases, what you would do is you would ask a question that would give you the information needed to determine if they are above or below the poverty line. So for instance, you, instead of asking them if they're above or below the poverty line, which, they reasonably, your participant may not know if they're above or below the poverty line or not, because they might not know what the poverty line is. Instead, you would just ask them, what is your total household income? And so they would report their income, and you could then use the information from that answer. You could check it against what the federal poverty line is, or whatever metric you're using, to be able to group participants into categories based on their responses. Or you can do that in a multiple choice format. So instead of having participants enter in free response a number that represents their total household income, you could give them income ranges. Ask them to choose which range of income applies to them. So you could start with a range of like $0 to $10,000, 10,000 to 20,000, 20 to 30,000, etc. Give them ranges to choose from, and then you can set up that question so that some of the ranges will fall above the poverty line, some will fall below, and then you can group participants based on which category they choose. All right, and so it looks like those were all of the questions that were entered in so far. And we have reached the end of the hour. So if anyone has any last minute questions, you can enter one in now. But otherwise, we'll be ending the presentation there. All right, so if there are no more questions, again, thanks to everyone for attending the webinar today. I hope everyone found it helpful. And again, the information that's on the screen now, you can use to contact us if you would like additional help or more one-on-one help with your dissertation. And also keep in mind, we do have other webinars that cover different topics that you are welcome to check out as well. So again, thanks everyone for attending today, and I hope everyone has a great day.